when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed, I was asked by a colleague, what do you think about this law? And I said, I think it's beyond Congress's power. And my article was used by a judge. It made it up to the Supreme Court, and I persuaded the court. This was beyond Congress's power. RFRA, the shorthand version of it, is in my mind what has planted the seeds of the destructive fanaticism we have now. Because what RFRA did is it shifted religious liberty from saying religious believers are like everybody else. You obey the law unless you have an exemption or it's targeting you. What RFRA says is most laws don't apply to you.
Hey, Marci, where are you sitting? Where are you at?
I am at the campus of the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, because the way the bio thing reads is it says you're not a resident there. You do a thing there, but
so no, I'm a professor here.
Yeah.
I also have an appointment to the program for research on religion.
That's it. There's some place where you do it like you're not there. You're in spirit.
I know. You know, it's the academic universe. Every word matters.
But, yeah, and I can't read. You know, I don't know enough about that to be able to figure it out.
Yeah. For good reason.
Yeah. But in any case, it's great. So are you in your office?
I am.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm very happy you're with us, and I'm going to now be official and introduce you. This is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, which is a Facebook Live event and then shows up on YouTube and all the places podcasts go, and my Substack channel and all the rest of it. I am talking today with Marci A. Hamilton, who is the founder and CEO of Child USA. And let's see, Fels Institute of Government, Professor of Practice, Fox Family Pavilion Resident, Senior Fellow in the Program for Research on Religion at the University of Pennsylvania, where, according to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, is where you are right now.
I am at Penn right now, right in Philadelphia.
Yeah. And besides writing books and articles and all sorts of stuff, and an article in particular that I want to talk with you about today, Mike Johnson, Theocrat, the House Speaker, and the Plot Against America, second in line to the presidency, the Republican makes claims about the Constitution and Christianity and his wish to impose his faith on others that do not withstand serious scrutiny. And we will go there. But before we do, I wanted to just talk to you about one other thing, and that is that you clerked, I believe, for Sandra Day O'Connor. Isn't that correct?
I did clerk for Justice O'Connor.
So before we dive into our subject today, given the fact that she just passed away, when was the last time you had any contact with her?
So I spoke to her right before the pandemic. I visited her at the home where she was, as the diagnosis of dementia had been announced, and it was our last conversation, but it was wonderful. And I was just blessed to be able to see her before it had progressed too far.
What was your original connection with Justice O'Connor? And if you don't mind me asking, when you clerked for her, just roll us back to the year and give me an approximation of how old you were and how long she had been in the on the court bench. Just give us a little picture of that.
Sure. So I was there the year 1989 to 90, that term, and she had been on the bench, 6-7 years. And I came directly from a Court of Appeals clerkship with Judge Edward R. Becker, who is the mensch of all time, and landed in the clerkship with Justice O'Connor. Being a Supreme Court clerk is a lot like getting hit by lightning. Mm-hmm. There are so many wonderful people that apply, and I was just very fortunate to be able to, she hired me and we really hit it off. And I view her, as I've said to others, I call her my law mom. Yeah. She was a mentor. She was very concerned about me doing the right things in my career. And she set an example, just extraordinary example of professionalism, but also in just being who you are. I don't think I've ever known anyone who was more thoroughly authentic than Justice O'Connor.
Mm. Yeah, I remember when she was nominated. I can't remember the year. What year was that? It was
1981 was when they first reached out.
yeah, and I think that was Reagan
Yep.
who talked to her, because back in the very bad old days, I don't know if you know anything about my story, and that's not what we're here to talk about, but to give a little context to it, I produced a series of films with my dad and Dr. C. Everett Koop, who became Reagan's Surgeon General, called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that then sort of historian type people say was the beginning of the militant evangelical pro-life movement. When she was nominated, I remember talking with C. Everett Koop about it, and the kind of anger and disappointment later when she was not as anti-abortion as we had all hoped she would be. And in looking back on it, it was kind of one of those pre-Bork culture war things where, I was already beginning to ask questions that eventually led me out of the movement,
Right.
but I wasn't out yet. But I can remember I forget what year that would have been, where one of her rulings and which that was. Can you refresh my memory? Why were we all so angry with her? What did she do to betray us, quote unquote?
Well, so the year before I clerked, in the Webster opinion, she absolutely refused to agree to invalidate Roe v. Wade. And Justice Scalia went after her quite personally in the language of the opinion. When I started, there were 3 challenges to Roe v. Wade. And if she had agreed to change her vote, it would have been invalidated in 1989.
Right.
But she refused to do that. And so all those cases were withdrawn. And then in 1993, we had the Casey case, where she went through with she and Justice Kennedy essentially saying, look, there's no reason to overrule this at this time. They watered down the standard a bit, but she really did infuriate the right-wing Christians when she just didn't fall in line. And there was never any pause, never any questioning on her part. That's where she was going to be from the beginning, and it's where she stayed.
Yeah, and I can remember after I kind of began to change my own opinion on that, she always seemed to me to be the kind of person I would refer to when I had discussions with some of my friends who were further to the left than me, and kind of wrote off anybody who had ever been more conservative than they were. And I would point to her and just say, hey, listen, this was a Republican appointment. There used to be a time when there were some reasonable people. My friend Jack Kemp, who was a congressman and vice presidential candidate with Bob Dole, was somebody like that, in the sense that it's hard to remember now through the smoke and fog and fury that we're living in the moment. But there was a time when there were people who were appointed, like Sandra Day O'Connor or Congressman Kemp, who headed up HUD for a while and was so active in housing and development for minorities and this kind of thing. So let's go there for a minute before we get into Mike Johnson. You've been around, and you're a constitutional expert, and you write a lot of wonderful things that I follow. Let's just talk a little bit about the arc to fanaticism and where we are, because that's something that just strikes me in both the left and the right, the polarization, but also just a bitter kind of fanaticism, which marks so many discussions on so many topics. And that's something that's changed in my lifetime. And I know you've tracked the same thing. So let's just talk a little bit about that arc toward fanaticism, which has a direct impact on any constitutional interpretation. You think of Amy Coney Barrett now, and the majority on the Supreme Court, and who they are and the kind of fanaticism they represent. I'd just like your opinion on a kind of an overview before we get to the Mike Johnson specifics.
Sure. So I really landed feet first in the modern religious movement on the conservative side when I did the Bernie v. Flores case at the Supreme Court, challenging the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It started 5 years after I actually left the court. It's the first case I ever had, ended up in the Supreme Court. But the whole topic was, does the Constitution stand for the right to avoid every law because your faith demands it? Or do religious people have to obey the law? And the Supreme Court, of course, Employment Division versus Smith said in 1990, you have to obey the law unless the law is targeting you. And that just made so much sense to me. And when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed, I was asked by a colleague, what do you think about this law? And I said, I think it's beyond Congress's power. And my article was used by a judge. It made it up to the Supreme Court, and I persuaded the court. This was beyond Congress's power. RFRA, the shorthand version of it, is in my mind what has planted the seeds of the destructive fanaticism we have now. Because what RFRA did is it shifted religious liberty from saying religious believers are like everybody else. You obey the law unless you have an exemption or it's targeting you. What RFRA says is most laws don't apply to you. And what that means is that you don't have to care anymore what harm you inflict on others. So the fanaticism I see is the push for a Christian theocracy that is measured by a minority's religious lights, but never takes into account who is harmed and doesn't have to. So it's like we decided that there should be no common ground anymore. And so from where I'm sitting, that was the beginning. I ended up writing 2 books on it and being to this day just very worried about a culture where your religious faith can be enough to let other people be harmed just because of what you believe.
You know, my perspective is that when we were activists in the 70s and 80s and beginning to launch so much that has wound up, let's just call it Mike Johnson / Amy Coney Barrett like theocratic movement, first of all, nobody had heard of us outside of our circle. So my father was very famous and a best-selling author, but the New York Times in their wisdom never reviewed a book like A Christian Manifesto calling for the violent overthrow of the US government unless we won on abortion. It sold 1 million copies, probably more than anything that they had on their list at that time. And yet, you know, in that kind of East Coast, rather snobbish higher education way, that the left or liberals or just say reasonable educated people managed to ignore the movement I was part of for long enough so that when it sandbagged them and they all woke up one morning and Donald Trump was president, it was like, you know, who did this? And of course, this is glib and I don't really mean it. It makes me sound silly, but in a way, it was like I wanted to turn to them and say, well, we did. And you know, in your great wisdom, you chose to act as if people like Dad and me and Dr. Koop and our views didn't exist. But the groundwork we were laying is exactly where Mike Johnson comes from. And of course, he's been
100%.
Yeah. And he's been
if I could just explain why I have some insights that maybe others don't.
Yeah.
I was Presbyterian and my family moved to Wheaton, Illinois. And in Wheaton, Illinois, the Bible belt buckle, I was told routinely I was going to hell as a Presbyterian. It was the culture of the community. And so I understood very early on the power of the evangelical movement to both marginalize and otherwise. Now, I got sucked into it as a high schooler. I was saved by none other than Billy Graham in the Chicago Crusade. But at the price of my mental health. And so I see now what I saw then, which is a way of looking at the world that believes in not just proselytizing, but imposition. And I think that's a lot of where we are. That's how we got here in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And I think by the time we get to your article on Mike Johnson that calls out this theocratic movement, we're still in a place where a lot of folks who read that, you know, you have to begin to draw parallels and say, do you want to live in an evangelical Christian version of Iran, for instance? You know, how do you like the way the Saudis manage things? To get an American to sort of understand that we're not just throwing around terms here, but a guy like Mike Johnson, who's a follower by a couple removes through other people who have been his mentors, of people like Russes Rushdoony, who wrote in the 1970s that we needed to go back to a literal Old Testament interpretation of the law. And, it's so interesting to me when I hear discussions of people who have been outside the loop. They talk about this as if somehow these are originalists who want to get back to the founding documents. No, they look at the founding documents as a humanist Enlightenment mistake that took us away from our, quote, biblical roots. So it's interesting because, we talk about Mike Johnson and his sort of approach to gay rights and this kind of thing as if that's the problem. There's a much deeper problem, and that is that when you get to the far reaches of the religious right, which, by the way, we used to be outsiders. We didn't have a Speaker of the House.
Oh, true. True.
we were like the unwelcome guest at the party. You have to put up with him because he knows some people who know some people. But as soon as he's gone, we all just laugh about it. That's how Reagan looked at us, and that's how I think some of the Bush family did as well. We were necessary evils to bring them voters. But the fact of the matter is, Mike Johnson is different and Amy Coney Barrett are different because they were groomed by the kind of people that we were working with, like Rushdoony or my father directly in the case of Amy Coney Barrett. And what they don't understand is that, we fundamentally did not believe in the Constitution. What we were pushing for was a return to what we called biblical absolutes. And we denounced secular humanism, and that would include the Enlightenment figures, including our American Enlightenment figures like Paine and Jefferson and others. And we weren't buying into their ideas. We were saying we need to go back to biblical authority. And I just, now I want you to take it from there in terms of what your article in The Guardian was about, which I just want to remind people that the title of that is self-explanatory because, you're talking about his biblical absolutes there. And, if he says, if you want to know what I believe, read the Bible. It's easy to pass over if you haven't actually read the Bible. So take it from there.
So Mike Johnson is part of a movement that has been fomented to a large degree by Leonard Leo and others who are the more public faces for a movement to create what they call as a Christian country. I completely agree. There's no possibility of saying that at the founding, there was an intent to create some kind of Christian country. Many of them were deists. Many of them, and frankly, the Constitution doesn't talk about God. It doesn't talk about religious liberty on purpose. But what we have now is a constructed court of individuals who have deep beliefs in what amounts to a fundamentalist Catholic worldview. Yeah. And in that worldview, the Catholic beliefs should be the government. And they are partnered with the evangelicals who also have that belief. And Mike Johnson is just an example of someone who believes, and I have no doubt sincerely, that we would all be better off if the government was run by Christians who agree with him. And the American people fully do not understand this. I'm writing a book called I Told You So, because I've been making these points since 1997, when I was shocked into understanding through the Bernie case what was really going on. And what was really going on is a belief that the American public fundamentally has fallen away from God and is sinful, and that they have the answers. And so they are operating at several different levels. What Mike Johnson has done is, of course, to work with the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is one of the most activist groups in this universe. And sincerely believes that gays are sinners and abominations, and that you should not have to associate with them, and that you should not have to, in governance, explain yourself other than reading the Bible. That is it's a very thin way for 300 plus million people to be able to come to any agreement on anything, governance, let alone. And it's destructive, but it's also incapable of adjustment. This is what is most disturbing to me, is that they just keep pushing, and the end always justifies the means. Literally making up the history is just fine. The history of the United States. Quoting, Michael McConnell, who was a federal judge and a professor, is definitely on the side of this, of Mike Johnson's side of the movement. And he published an article early on in which he said that the Constitution requires accommodation for every religious believer that is based on faulty historical data and information. It has been disavowed, it has been discredited by me, by Philip Hamburger, by Ellis West. I mean, really, really brilliant, smart law professors. But his article continues to be used by the right in arguments to the Supreme Court. So the poison that we are experiencing right now is a result of the majority of Americans who don't share these beliefs, who don't want a theocracy, not having understood. They needed to start standing up 4 decades ago. And the question is, can we catch up to it?
Yeah, and one thing I just want to interject, and I'd like your opinion on it. It seems to me that, Donald Trump didn't deliver for many people, but he did deliver for the evangelicals. And people like Tony Perkins from the Family Research Council basically gave him lists from the Federalists and other people of who they would, as evangelical voters, like to see him nominate. And of course, this is very much in your neck of the woods. He succeeded in doing their work for them by hundreds of judges and Supreme Court justices. Talking about Americans who don't quite get it, it just seems quite amazing to me that between the evangelical movement, people like the Family Research Council, myself included back in the day, and then going forward with Federalists and so forth, which are, very influenced by the Roman Catholic people, but also by evangelicals, that the vision that came with Roe in terms of opposition to it eventually became a long-range project that took more than 50 years to achieve. And, I don't think you have to look too much further than achieving that project as for the, quote, reason why all these evangelical leaders went along with this philandering ape of a human who has been credibly accused of rape and all the rest, and no problem with them because they see him as a handmaid of God.
Right.
Proving that he is doing God's will. Nothing else matters. And if he wins again, it'll be for the same reason. But I'd like you to zero in on what has happened to our courts, the damage that has been wrought by these appointments overall. I don't know enough about that. You do. So tell us about that.
Well, let me just start by saying I wrote a column in which I asked the question, how in the world would evangelicals ever support Donald Trump recently? We were asking 6-7 years ago, but right now, why is it? And my conclusion was, it's not just that they serve each other's ends, but they both are at base lawless. They don't believe in the rule of law. And when you don't believe in the rule of law, you can create political bedfellows just based on power. And that's really what I'm seeing for that portion of it. What has been wrought on the federal courts and at the Supreme Court? Tragically, we're seeing judges who are not qualified, but did make it through the appointment, but are using God to justify their decisions, are essentially joining the battle to get rid of civil rights. And so, the notion that you would unravel the FDA's approval of the abortion pill is just beyond belief that anybody would bring that argument. It was approved decades ago. It's been proven safe. But the right was able to find a Trump judge, who was willing to say, oh, well, that FDA approval is probably deficient, so we probably can get rid of the abortion pill. That shows you a level of planning and a level of community. where such an argument is being floated by the right, but it is being accepted and expected from the right-leaning judges. And, the other part of it is the lack of judicial independence. There was no one who was more independent than Justice O'Connor. I learned from her just the strength of a person who decides things on their own without being pushed. She had bags of mail in her hallway of people writing her about abortion. It didn't change her. She didn't count. She just did what she believed in. And the judge that has been overseeing the Mar-a-Lago secret documents, top secret documents, has given people pause, has reached decisions that aren't supported in the law because the Court of Appeals reversed them. But there's this allegiance to someone that you should never see in a judge. A judge is supposed to be impartial. So I'm worried at both levels. I'm worried about content and specific issues that are coming down the pike. And in a minute, I'll tell you which issue I'm most concerned about right now. But I'm also concerned about judicial ethics and judicial independence. You just don't see the blindfold on Lady Liberty in all of these judges. But, the next issue, and Alliance Defending Freedom has been saying this for years, people just weren't paying attention, is attacking birth control. It's not just that they're against abortion, they are adamantly against birth control. Right. And they have cases percolating in the courts that they hope to land in the right offices so that we might see that even Griswold, guaranteed a right to contraception, could be overturned on the identical reasoning of Dobbs. Dobbs was written not to overrule Roe. It was written intentionally to unravel the reasoning that is supporting right now both LGBTQ rights and rights to contraception.
Yeah, and the related issue that my producer Ernie sent me a little note on that I'll get to in just a second, but I want to reintroduce you. My guest today is Marci Hamilton. You're listening to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. If you like this, please like it in the online sense of sharing it. Subscribe to my It Has to Be Said Substack thing. I think I've got the name right. And please share this because it's an important conversation. Marci is a constitutional expert, clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, has gone on to write a lot of books. We're going to link to those wherever this is, link to Marci's sites wherever this is. And now I'm going to go to this related question. In the New Republic's reporting on 303 Creative LLC v. Elenis, Melissa Gira Grant writes, quote, It looks like Smith and her attorneys have perhaps unwittingly invented a gay couple in need of a wedding website in a case in which they argue that same-sex marriages are false, end quote. So Ernie's question to you is, and it's a good one, how do we stop these fabricated complaints making their way to the Supreme Court when they are legitimizing discrimination? And that fits in with what you were saying, is this is an intent and there's a step process here and there is a strategy here. It is not simply case by case. There, first goes Roe, Dobbs, contraceptive is being targeted, gay rights. You almost get the feeling that they're parsing these out, like what can we get away with now? But the cases are lined up, whether they're real or fabricated. So would you address that? Because I think it's a good question, just this idea of fabricated cases, and even if they're not, this idea of a strategic approach to undermining our civil rights.
So, the 303 Creative case is really disturbing because, as it turns out, she did have a website and no gay couples tried to get her assistance. And then she buried it. And the lawyers knew all of this. So, first of all, how do you stop that kind of fabrication of lawsuits? What you do is you penalize lawyers that bring them. It is an outrage that lawyers would have been able to bring a case knowing that the arguments were actually misleading, and the facts were not accurate. So for any other attorney, for any other circumstance, they would have been chastised. They would have been, if not losing their licenses, they should have been severely chastised. But that didn't happen in this humongous case here in the United States. The Supreme Court, once there was any inkling that this might not be a good case in terms of where the facts were, should never have taken the case. And secondly, they should have what it's called a dig. You did not, after granting it, you deny it as improvidently granted. This was the wrong vehicle. But for me, and in another column I wrote for The Guardian, I talk about the problem with that case is that the court made up the free speech doctrine that's used in that case. And the court completely trivializes the public accommodations laws. And so by turning her expression, which is really conduct, so it's expressive conduct, by turning it into pure speech because it's religion, and treating pure speech as absolutely protected, and then giving less than 2 pages to the importance of the public accommodations laws, the court turned free speech on its head and opened doors for believers of any stripe to be able to discriminate against anyone. It is destructive, but we have a majority of the Supreme Court that's willing to do that. And so what's the answer? The media. The media is the answer in terms of outing to the public. What the biggest issue here is, how do you get the majority of believers in the United States, and whether they're atheists or religious, how do you get them to understand the existential threat that's being aimed at their rights to conscience? And I don't think we found the answer to that yet.
Yeah, looking at the court as it stands now, the Supreme Court, that is, in terms of Amy Coney Barrett and the others, you know, if you could think about what their idea of the best of all worlds is, you know, when they shut their eyes at night and think about what they want to do next. You know, what I want to do next is go pick up my grandchildren in school and feed them this evening, and then continue to work on a book I'm working on, in the best of all worlds. You know, that's where I'm at. And back in the days, I was a movie maker. It was to get funding for my next project. I kind of had ideas of what I wanted. I'm not sure I can picture, outside of Handmaid's Tale, you know, what is it they think is the world that should be, you know, how far do you think they're willing to go with this? And how did they see their lives intersecting Trump's life and the threat he is to our democracy and our values, basically, essentially, even more than the theocratic thing? I just wonder, you know, how some of these justices see themselves in American history, and what role do they feel they're playing? Have you got some insight? I mean, you walk those halls of power, and you're a powerful judicial force yourself, and have ideas about what you would like to do. I have a hard time seeing how they see themselves and what they think the end game is here, in terms of stripping one group of people after another: women of right to abortion, women of right to the abortion pill, women of right to contraceptives, gay people to marriage, to acceptance. You know, the list keeps getting ticked and keeps getting longer. Rolling back voting rights, I mean, which is perhaps even, you know, more consequential. I don't even know where to begin and end, but I don't see what they feel their end game is. I guess Mike Johnson, you know, wants us to be in John Calvin's Geneva, where we're ruled by Old Testament law. That's where he'd like to take us. I mean, their heroes are all Oliver Cromwell and people like that. Where do you think these justices, you know, I guess the counterpoint is, I would say, in the best of all worlds, how did Justice Sandra Day O'Connor see her role? And in the best of all worlds, who did she feel she was representing? I guess that's a good place to start. That's a better way to ask the question, as opposed to say where these folks would like to see things go. I don't know if you want to go there, but I would love to hear your opinion.
So Justice O'Connor decided cases according to their facts. She believed that she had only the power, the limited power, to decide the case directly in front of her. And she was a big believer in the incremental development of the law. And so each case she took quite seriously. She understood it. Justice Scalia, to use an example that's a contrast, his approach to cases was much more like Zeus, as though he was supposed to throw the lightning bolt of truth for each case, and then from then on, everybody else could work out the details. The current court, I do think John Roberts, the Chief Justice, has common sense and sees the disaster that's facing his court. Mm-hmm. And he keeps trying to rein them in, including in the Dobbs decision. He would try to tell them, just talk about abortion. Don't go all out for this huge theory. But of course, he was unable to do it. I think the others do view their role very similarly to what Justice Scalia viewed his role, which is that they have been appointed for the purpose of providing grand truths to the American public, which then should be followed in later cases. And so what that means is they tap into whatever their beliefs are about natural law, what their beliefs are about what God or the church requires. And, reading the Dobbs opinion, there are, if you understand theology and you understand the way in which the Federalist Society has taken apart the right to privacy, it's a meld of those two things. Mm-hmm. It's a worldview. And they are unashamed about it because they think it's better for the world, I suppose. I mean, I can't get into their heads. But what's terrifying is the concept that you would have justices that have divorced themselves from simply looking at the facts of a case and deciding the case or controversy in front of them, and to jump to trying to decide every possible version of the case all the way to the logical end of where their faith will take them.
Let me make a little jump here. Again, I'm speaking with Marci Hamilton, author, constitutional expert, clerked with Justice OConnor, has been observing this for a long time and writing about it for The Guardian and other places. And we're doing this little chat today because I was reading an article recently by Marci in The Guardian on Mike Johnson, someone who I've talked about as well, and the whole movement toward theocracy. I want to jump out of that for a moment and talk to you about the place of women in America right now as we speak. I am distressed, and I'm doubly distressed because I played a part as a young fool in my 20s with the situation that now faces my friends and my family in watching women be stripped, not just of abortion rights, but access to the abortion pill if they get their way, privacy on so many levels, and all the rest of it. And I feel a lot of weight from that and remorse and regret. And I've spent a lot of time writing and talking about this, trying to undo some of the damage we did. But it just seems to me that we've taken an enormous step backward in electing a molester like Trump and letting that just sort of sit there. I can't imagine, someone who's credibly accused of rape and all the rest of this. And, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and on and on and on. And then he appoints these people who have stripped women of their most fundamental basic rights to bodily autonomy. I'm picking my granddaughter up. I know this stupid male thing that, I have sisters and wives, and so I identify. No, that's not the reason why. But I do fear for my granddaughter's future. I don't like the direction America's going in. I don't like what the Saudis do to women. I don't like seeing people being raped in police cells in Saudi Arabia and in Tehran, and it's okay. I hate the direction this country's taking when it comes to women. And I really am emotionally exercised by this more than almost anything else. I just think we're in a phenomenally horrible place, and all sorts of people are suffering. The Black vote is being diminished and all the rest of this. But it just seems to me that, my plea is for everybody to wake up, but particularly, my friends who are women, and just saying, you have no idea who these people are and the world you will inhabit if they get a tenth of their way on these things. And I it's not a question. I'm just throwing this out to you.
So it's really been interesting in the last year and a half, especially with the new consolidation of the Supreme Court. I keep thinking back to growing up in Wheaton, Illinois, and in high school, on the outside of the home, I would be either part of the evangelical groups, which, as I said, did not end up well for me, or I'd be at school or whatever. It was a very conservative town. Women had their roles, men had their roles, but I was reading Betty Friedan, right? And that was the safe space. That was where I was being told, you really can be a powerful woman and you better be. And I was reading all of those kinds of materials. In my household, thinking was a good thing. And I haven't even thought about that, of being in that room and being so alone, but feeling free compared to the outside world until recently. And I think what it is I think that we have a generation or two that don't understand what it was like for it to be an oddity for a justice to be a female on the Supreme Court. It's easy to take for granted your rights. And what we get is we have this politically powerful, highly paid, highly supported movement, which some of them, believe that the husband should pick out what the woman wears every day. Many of them believe the woman should be subjected to her biology 100%. So it is a dangerous time to lose the rights of women. But I hope that all the women in power right now will educate and say, we didn't get this too long ago, right? Women were not in power. It really was just one female at the Supreme Court. Nobody ever thought about adding another one for quite a while. So I agree with you with the concern. I also think, as a true Presbyterian, part Calvinist, right? I do believe that people who have power will abuse it. And I think that the religious right is right on the precipice of the abuse. So that going all that distance to get rid of Roe that quickly, that was an abuse of power.
Yes.
But I think as that moves on, I think you're going to get more and more pushback. I wish them luck if they think they're going to be able to make contraception unavailable. 90% of Americans use it. I mean, it's just a fact, whether there are theologians who think they shouldn't. Sure. But I do believe we're at the top of the pendulum swing. We're in a very extreme moment, but I think it's possible that they've already overplayed their hand, but I think they're going to continue to. And frankly, the choice of Mike Johnson as the Speaker of the House is an example of pushing the envelope that probably is going to push them over the edge.
Yeah, and I want to go back to something you said earlier because it ties into this, but I just want to put it in capital letters with an exclamation point. You said something to the effect that the evangelical right and these theocrats, Catholic and evangelical, this group that we're talking about, Trump aside, because he's a different thing, but that, well, in this case, this really does apply to him, that essentially they do not respect the rule of law. They do not recognize it. And I just want you, because I really like to hear, they respect a rule of law, but it's not our rule of law. They've got a different standard. And so their idea of the rule of law is a biblical mandate in which other points of view are never tolerated, because this is heresy trials that eventually get people burnt at stakes, if you want to go back to the wars of religion in Europe. But let's really go there in terms of what is the American constitutional definition of the rule of law that they reject, A. B, What do they mean by going back to biblical law, and why are these two things in opposition? Let's just go there, because this really is a big point.
So the rule of law under the Constitution means that laws are duly enacted. They go through both houses of Congress. They're signed by the president. And once they're signed, the law applies to everyone equally.
Yeah.
The evangelical push, which, as I said, really became very public with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the reason they wanted RFRA is because RFRA says you don't have to obey the law.
Just tell us again what RFRA.
Okay. Sure. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act says that any law that substantially burdens someone's faith, and by that, by the way, that means in any way, tangentially or remotely, because it was amended to make it as huge as possible. So any aspect of one's faith that is substantially burdened, which means de minimis burden because of the way the courts have interpreted it. So anybody with a belief can bring a lawsuit and say that that law doesn't apply to them. And then the government has to prove, no, that law serves a compelling interest, which is an interest of the highest order, public safety, for example. But here is the devil that's in the details here. The government must also show that that law is the least restrictive means of regulating for that believer. In other words, the government has to show how that law is tailored to the believer. So let me give you a good example of the way RFRA operates. There was a woman in Indiana who beat her child with a hanger. It was horrific. The child was horrifically harmed, and she was arrested for it. Why did she do it? Spare the rod, spoil the child. She had a biblical reason for destroying this child. The prosecution went forward and she had a defense. Her defense was the state RFRA. And the argument is this: what is the least restrictive means of punishing her, right? Do you put her in jail, or do you just give her probation, right? Do you just fine her? What is the least restrictive of all those options? It's a fine or just giving her a little probation. That's what happened. RFRA says the least possible penalty. So RFRA has been used, of course, to justify violating public health by saying you don't have to take the COVID vaccine. RFRA has been used, and its formulation, our LUPA, Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, has been used by religious groups to argue that they don't have to abide by zoning like everybody else does. What it does is it teaches that if you're religious, you have a special exception that nobody else has. That is the antithesis of the rule of law.
Yeah.
Right.
That's really good. And there's a bridge to something here I want to talk about. James Carvell, who I had on the other day, and we talked, I think just called my producer and had a question he wants to throw in here. And he was saying about Mike Johnson's usage of children in his culture wars with regards to child abuse. And you've just sort of gone there, but this is peripheral to that, but it's important. You know, Dr. Dobson once gave away a book I wrote years ago when I was on the religious right called A Time for Anger. And I think he gave away like 250,000 copies. Parenthetically here, people who told me, you jumped ship for the money because, you know, whatever. No, the God money was where it all really worked well for Jeannie and me. Since then, we've struggled, but okay. But his question was, how is child abuse at the core of what we're dealing with from the right? And you sort of already went there. And all I want to say is one of the things that Dr. Dobson had in his book was a justification of beating children. And there are many evangelical churches, and here's one that a lot of people don't know, that have in their gift shop what they call spanking spoons. They sell wooden spoons to hit your child with. The preacher preaches on corporal punishment, and as a cute little thing in the gift shop with a ribbon, no kidding, is a row of spoons the right size to hit a child with. And they believe in corporal punishment. And speaking what you were just saying, if you arrested them, they would claim religious liberty in the same way that Gordon College down the road from me, when it got a new president a few years ago, went to Barack Obama and said, we want an exemption from being able to fire faculty when we find out they're gay, because we don't care what the law in Massachusetts says about discrimination. We're Christians. And so James Carvell question through Ernie to you is about the relationship of child abuse to these issues on the right. And I'm widening it to just, again, let's keep talking about this. We don't have to obey the laws because our religion preempts those discussions, and it's across the board, and it isn't just birthday cakes or wedding cakes.
So we have seen a really disturbing increase in this verbiage about parental rights. And parental rights is cover for the ability to treat your child like property, to make every decision about that child without respect to their well-being, whether it is abuse or corporal punishment, whether it's food, whether it's medical treatment. So I started Child USA because we needed a think tank for the civil rights of children. Children are treated, were property until a little over 100 years ago. They're not property anymore. And so the backlash among the conservative right is to try to get them back into their ownership mode so that they can own them and do whatever they want to them. And that is dangerous for the country. It's dangerous for children. But, one of the most dangerous movements in the country for children, of course, is homeschooling.
Yeah.
Because every safety net that we've created for children, including mandated reporters, is taken out of the picture. And of course, that was led by Mike Ferris on the right. And it's intended to create a universe of control. So what do I think about child abuse and the right? Right now, I think that they are going down a really dangerous path. I do see the objectification of women. I see the reduction in women's rights, but hand in hand with that is the reduction in children's rights. But and then let me just talk a little bit about the right's absolutely gobsmacking, ridiculous stuff about grooming. Right? So child sex abuse is often started with a grooming process, which is when the perpetrator gets all the people around the child inured and happy with them so they can get the child alone. And they're also grooming the child, whether they do it with pornography or alcohol or drugs or candy or special attention. They groom them. It is a term in the literature about child sex abuse, about what happens before the sexual act. They now talk about grooming as though adults who work with children are automatically grooming them because they're gay. This is such a sick interpretation of what is basically a clinical term. And it just reinforces that the end is justifying the means again and again and again. So if God is your end, then it's okay to make up the science, to ignore the science, but also to really make a joke of what is really an epidemic in the United States, which is child sex abuse across all quarters, whether it's right or left.
Yeah, or Roman Catholic priests or whomever it might be. Let me go somewhere here before we wrap this out, and that is kind of picking up from what you were just saying there was something you wanted to say. In terms of what you strive for, in terms of your priorities, I'd like to ask you two questions, sort of a personal one, and then the public manifestation of that. The personal side is, in the best of all worlds, what would Marci like to see happen in terms of priorities? I want to see Trump lose the next election. That's one thing that just has to happen. That's an emergency, all hands on deck situation. I want to see these things reversed. I want to see women's rights defended. and all down the list we've got. In the best of all worlds, we would have from my point of view, a kind of an enlightened, humanistic, return to constitutional principles, et cetera, et cetera. That's sort of where I'm going. And then, and then on the personal side, it's a little bit different. I would like to see how these things play out in my children and grandchildren's future when I'm not here. I would like that to happen. So let me go there for you on the personal side a little bit, and on the public side. Is it one of the same? How do you see things? What's your priority list? As in, look, all these things matter, but if I could push the button and just make this happen, we could start. How do you see that?
If we could get the American public to see the truth about religion, that it is both an incredible force for good, an incredible force for evil, and that we must deal with that. It is not, it's not the 50s. It's not apple pie. It's not always good for you. It is potentially dangerous. If we could get the American people to see that religious actors can and will harm them for their faith, I think that we can have the public understanding that will undermine the movement to a theocracy, which I think is the biggest existential threat we have right now. And at the same time, that would bring down Trump, because those are his voters. Now, from maybe that's the public part of it. The personal part of it is my dad believed in the truth, and I was raised to tell the truth. It's the only thing we ever got in trouble for is if we didn't tell the truth. My whole career has been dedicated just to telling the truth. And I think it's capable of extraordinary change, and we need it more than we ever did.
Yeah, and that would really segue well into what I wanted to say and kind of as we wrap this up. And that is, Marci, you're a constitutional law professor, so you know what you're talking about. And, you said earlier that the media, in a kind of a general term, is the key to unraveling all of this and saving our democracy. Okay, you're talking to me on my podcast, and I have various online sites, and in my little tiny pebble in the wall way, I'm trying to do this. So what I'm trying to do here with this conversation, and the Substack, it has to be said, and all this other stuff, is discuss a range of issues, but with a very clear set of priorities of one, we'll talk about this and we'll talk about that, and it's a ballet dancer and a rock star and an author. But in the end, I really want to know what whoever it is in front of me, are going to do about these three things. How do we not get Trump elected? What do we do about the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm asking you, and I'm not trying to be cute, what can we do with the things we're doing to push hard on this, because we share your vision of what the media should be, and we want to do that. I don't want to waste time. I don't want to be trivial. So as you look at podcasts and the kind of guests we get and what we can do and what we can talk about, what should we just keep plugging on no matter what else is going on?
I think the under-discussed issue of the day is, in all truth, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It is its 30th anniversary. You'll notice it's only being celebrated by the right. When it first started, the left was foolish enough to support it. They quickly backed off because they realized, well, I kept saying, you're making a mistake. Yeah. RFRA is destroying our country because of this attitude that if you're a believer, you shouldn't have to obey the law. I think that needs to be highlighted. I think on this 30th anniversary, we need to look back and say, that was a big mistake, and it's time to get rid of it. And that will take incredible guts by members of Congress, because how can you vote against the Religious Freedom Restoration Act? But you can certainly gut it. And there's a bill, the Do No Harm bill, that's up there right now. That should be passed because it would protect gays from it, but we all should be protecting children. Children are at huge risk of religious actors. Just look at South Dakota, where there are graveyards where there are more babies than adults. So that's my message.
Well, it's a good one, and I want to follow up on it practically. and that is, beside having you on every 3 days to talk about this, I'd like you to do 2 things for me here on, we're not on the air. What do you call this when you're just out there in the ozone layer? But whatever this is, but also privately with my producer, Ernie, I would like you to please send us a couple of the articles you want us to put everywhere that you've written on this subject, so we can follow up with that. Because Mike Johnson is a big deal, but this is a bigger deal, and we'll follow up by putting them everywhere we can. Secondly, would you please take a moment as we wrap up here and come up with the name of a couple other people, whether they're legislators or actors or a guy you met in a taxi cab, we don't care, who have a point of view on this, especially as it relates to children, who we can also have as a guest to talk about RFRA and really keep diving down. Let's do 3 or 4 more guests on this topic so we can keep making a big deal of it by talking to people. And then lastly, please come back and talk about this. So if something's coming up that matters and you have a few minutes for us, please tell Ernie, my producer, look, something's coming up, an anniversary of whatever it is, or a legislation before the House, whatever it may be, and then just come back on a couple days' notice and talk to us about it so we can follow this train of thought, because we will do our best to make what you've said should be a priority. I have spoken about this before, by the way, the whole rule of law thing, but not enough. We need to do more on this. So thank you so much for all your work, especially on behalf of children.
I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. And I got to say, I have so much respect for you.
Oh, thank you.
Right. It's the soul of integrity to have done one thing and then to stand up and say it was wrong and to do the other thing.
Well,
so,
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. That means a lot to me. And I'm so happy you were here and what you're doing. We talk to a lot of different people, but you're doing something that's more than important. I mean, it's the hinge of the future of our country. So please stay well, take care of yourself, keep speaking, and please let us be part of that speaking out.
Will do. We'll send over some materials and I hope we talk again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
Until next time, talk to you later, Marci. Bye-bye.